US single-family home building increases 3.3% in December. The IMF raises its global growth forecast for 2025 to 3.3%. And China's economy grows 5% in 2024. Hello there and welcome to the Qnews Economic Bulletin, where we bring you the latest developments shaping the global economy. From key market trends and financial updates to regional economic highlights and forecasts, we provide essential news and analysis to keep you informed. Welcome. And we start off tonight with the United States, where Scott Bessent, the President-elect Donald Trump's nominee for Treasury Secretary, has warned of a growing U.S. spending problem. Addressing the Senate Finance Committee, Bessent said that current spending levels, despite the absence of a war or recession, leave the U.S. less prepared for future crises. He emphasized the Treasury's crucial role in past emergencies and called for greater fiscal responsibility under the new administration. The Commerce Department has reported that U.S. single-family home building increased by 3.3% in December, reaching a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 1.050 million units. However, higher mortgage rates and oversupply of new homes are limiting further growth. The rise in mortgage rates, driven by higher U.S. Treasury yields and concerns about President-elect Donald Trump's policies, has impacted home building. The Federal Reserve has revised its projected rate cuts for 2025, and the average rate on 30-year fixed mortgages surpassed 7% for the first time since May. The World Bank has warned that a proposed 10% tariff on U.S. imports could slow global economic growth in 2025. If trading partners retaliate, the already modest forecast of 2.7% growth could fall by 0.3 percentage points. The tariffs outlined by President-elect Donald Trump include a 25% duty on imports from Canada and Mexico and a 60% tariff on Chinese goods. The World Bank's analysis suggests US GDP could shrink by 0.4% under the tariffs, with retaliation pushing the impact to 0.9%. The report also highlights persistent challenges for developing economies, projecting growth at 4% below pre-pandemic levels. That's due to high debt, weak investment, and the rising costs of climate change.
The World Bank has issued a stark warning about the potential global economic impact of proposed U.S. tariffs as President-elect Donald Trump prepares to take office. If the U.S. imposes a 10% tariff on all imports and trading partners retaliate, global economic growth in 2025 could fall by 0.3 percentage points, according to the World Bank's latest analysis. The proposed tariffs include a 25% duty on Canadian and Mexican goods and steep 60% on imports from China. The report shows that these measures could also shrink US GDP by nearly 1% if retaliations occurs, while global growth stagnates at projected 2.7%. Developing economies faces an even grimmer picture, weakened by high debt, sluggish investment, and rising climate costs. Their growth is expected to remain far below pre-pandemic levels. Foreign investment into these nations has halved since the early 2000s, while global trade restrictions are at record highs.
Now to some breaking news this evening. The US Supreme Court has upheld a law requiring TikTok's Chinese parent, ByteDance, to sell the app or face a ban starting this Sunday, citing national security concerns. The court ruled the law does not violate free speech rights, marking a setback for TikTok, used by nearly half of Americans. The Biden administration argues that TikTok's data practices pose a security threat, with fears that China could exploit user data for espionage or influence operations. The ban would restrict TikTok from US app stores and operations, impacting its 170 million American users and 7,000 employees. The International Monetary Fund has raised its global growth forecast for 2025 to 3.3%, citing robust US performance that offsets weaker projections for Europe. Growth in 2026 is also expected at 3.3%, with global inflation projected to decline to 4.2% in 25 and 3.5% in 26, enabling further monetary policy normalization. However, the IMF cautioned against unilateral protectionist policies like tariffs and subsidies, warning they could harm global trade and investment. The remarks come as President-elect Donald Trump proposes sweeping tariffs, including 60% on Chinese goods, 25% on imports from Canada and Mexico, and 10% on global imports. Now, some breaking news. We go live now to France's President Emmanuel Macron, who is speaking live in Beirut. Macron has highlighted the dire conditions faced by those displaced by Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon, stressing the urgent need for support. He also announced that Air France will soon resume flights to Lebanon as part of efforts to strengthen ties and assist the country during this crisis. Additionally, Macron called for transparency regarding the victims of the Beirut port explosion in 2020, underscoring the importance of justice for those affected.
Les mois, les années qui viennent, nous n'aurons pas simplement à tenir comme vous l'avez promis en 2020, parce que vous avez tenu, parce que nous avons tenu, mais nous aurons à faire grandir l'espoir. Et à faire que ce printemps de début janvier 2025 soit une saison qui ne s'arrête pas. Et que les espoirs nés ces derniers jours puissent pleinement continuer de s'épanouir parce que le pays le mérite. Voilà, mesdames et messieurs, ce que j'étais venu vous dire ce soir.
The French President Emmanuel Macron there speaking in Beirut. Now back to our economic news. The International Monetary Fund expected Britain to have the fastest growth among major European economies this year. The international organisation raised its 2025 growth forecast for the UK by 0.1 percentage point to 1.6%, making it the third strongest G7 economy after the US and Canada. The IMF also maintained a 1.5% growth projection for 2026. Staying with the UK, and the Office for National Statistics has reported that Britain's economic output grew by 0.1% in November, marking a return to expansion after 2 months of contraction. The modest recovery follows the October 30th budget by Finance Minister Rachel Reeves, which introduced significant tax increases, including higher social security contributions for employers. Reeves emphasised her commitment to accelerating economic growth, with plans to meet regulators this week to explore further measures. It also reported that economic output in November was 1% higher than a year earlier, falling short of the anticipated 1.3%. Britain's Finance Minister Rachel Reeves has said that she would continue making difficult decisions to grow the economy, despite growing calls for her resignation. In an interview, she defended her policies, including increases in social security contributions, saying that they were made in the national interest to stabilise public finances. Reeves, acknowledging the challenges of her role, expressed determination, likening herself to former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady. She emphasised that criticism would not deter her from carrying out the government's mandate to improve the economy and support working people. Now, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has dismissed US sanctions against his cabinet chief, Antal Rogan, as ineffective, saying they have only strengthened Rogan's position. The sanctions imposed earlier this month over alleged corruption were labelled by Orban as the outgoing US ambassador's petty revenge. Orban, a close ally of President-elect Donald Trump, voiced optimism about improved US-Hungarian relations under the incoming administration. Orban pledged to fight foreign networks and reiterated his goal to remove Hungarian-born financier George Soros' influence from Hungary and Europe. According to accounts from the European Central Bank's policymakers' December meeting, the bank is poised for gradual interest rate cuts as weakening price pressures continue. While a 25 basis point cut was unanimously agreed upon, policymakers emphasized the need for a cautious approach due to ongoing uncertainties. Despite an economy grappling with weak growth, the ECB is focusing on easing monetary policy to prevent hindering economic recovery. Inflation is expected to hit the 2% target around mid-year, but the timing and pace of further rate reductions remain under discussion. In Asia, China will impose provisional anti-dumping duties on imports of polyacetyl from the US, EU, Japan and Taiwan, effective January 24th. The duties range from 3.8% to 74.9% based on the country and company involved. The move follows a months-long investigation launched in May, coinciding with US tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and the EU's trade probe into Chinese steel imports. China imported around 3 billion yuan of these plastics from the affected regions in 2024. The highest duties will be levied on US firms, while EU companies face a 42% duty. Taiwanese and Japanese companies will face duties of 32.6% and 43.7% respectively. China's economy grew 5% in 2024, meeting the government's target, but concerns persist over structural imbalances and domestic demand. While industrial output and exports surged, many citizens report worsening living standards. President-elect Donald Trump's proposed tariffs, including a 60% duty on Chinese goods, could heighten trade tensions and economic strain in 2025. Beijing plans to counter with debt-fueled stimulus, raising fears over overcapacity and deflation. The National Bureau of Statistics has reported that new home prices in China held steady in December 2024, marking the first pause in declines since mid-2023. Official data showed a 0.1% rise month-on-month following a 0.1% fall in November, while annual prices dropped 5.3%, a slight improvement from November's 5.7% decline. The stabilization follows Beijing's stimulus measures, including mortgage rate cuts and government purchases of unsold properties, aimed at reviving confidence in a crisis-hit real estate sector. First-tier cities showed signs of recovery, though experts warn the broader market remains under pressure. Still in China, Kang Yi, head of the National Bureau of Statistics, reported that total retail sales of consumer goods reached 48.8 trillion yuan in 2024, marking a 3.5% year-on-year increase. The fourth quarter saw a 3.8% growth, outpacing the third quarter by 1.1 percentage points. Consumer demand drove 2.2 percentage points of economic growth for the year, with the fourth quarter contributing 1.6%. Despite these gains, Kang Yi, head of the Statistics Bureau, noted that more efforts are needed to boost spending. Policies to expand demand, a stable job market, and China's large population continue to support long-term growth in consumption. Government estimates have revealed that Japan's goal to achieve a primary budget surplus has been postponed to 2026. Rising debt servicing costs and additional spending to support economic recovery have pushed back the target. Initially aimed for fiscal 2025, the surplus is now projected at 800 billion yen for fiscal 2026. Japan's primary budget balance, excluding debt servicing and new bond sales, remains in deficit due to mounting public debt, which exceeds twice the size of its economy. Reconstruction of Gaza is now a top priority following a ceasefire agreement, with significant damage to residential infrastructure and private properties. Estimates for the cost of rebuilding Gaza range from $40 to $80 billion. But the greater challenge lies in the timeline, with reconstruction potentially stretching until 2040. According to the UN, the devastation in Gaza will require long-term efforts, with the rebuilding of destroyed homes expected to continue for years to come. Satellite imagery from the UN reveals that more than 170,000 buildings, that's around 69% of all structures in Gaza before the war, have been destroyed or severely damaged, underscoring the scale of the reconstruction task. Now, joining us from Cairo is the managing editor of Al Ahram newspaper, Mr. Ashraf Al-Ashri. Thank you very much for joining us here on Q News. Now, could you tell us this ceasefire agreement that will take effect on Sunday, when that happens, when could we expect reconstruction to begin?
مساء الخير عليكم وعلى
Good
أيضا السادة
evening for
المشاهدين.
you and good evening to the viewers. Of course, I think that there is a lot of interest being given to finalizing the hostage release agreement and entering the humanitarian aid with 600 trucks a day. And there is a technical committees being held in Cairo now to form an operation room to follow up the implementation of the agreement from Cairo, as Cairo will bear the most responsibility for the hostage exchange across the three phases. So all the efforts are being directed now to finalizing the agreement, and you know it's a three-phase agreement. Each one is a 40-day phase. Everyone will be following up the implementation of the agreement and entering the aid and the release of the hostages and the rehabilitation of the Gaza population, and then there will be a deep talk by the international community to discuss the Gaza reconstruction. Cairo was proactive, represented in Badr Abdulati, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Egypt, that Egypt will host an international conference for the Gaza reconstruction with an international fund supervised by the United Nations and major countries such as Egypt for the Gaza reconstruction, which will take a lot of time to mobilize the support and cooperation and assess the damage, as most 80% of the Gaza infrastructure was completely destroyed, and the World Bank will assess the needs of that will amount to $90 billion. The international community will need to set a plan with the European partners and allies, which will require a lot of discussions and communication. After the phase 1 and phase 2 of the agreement, talks will begin with cooperation with the United Nations and United States, headed by President Trump, and Egypt as a pioneering country with an integral role to implement the ceasefire agreement and to foster the resolution to the Israeli-Arab conflict. There will be agreements to host the international conference in Cairo after phase 1 and phase 2, and the release and exchange of hostages and detainees without any violations by Israel, so that the international community makes sure that this agreement takes place smoothly.
Now we're hearing that the cost of rebuilding Gaza is somewhere between 40 and $80 billion. What do you think it might cost, and where is this money going to come from?
Of course, there is a large part to be played by the international community and the GCC. Everyone now is directed to the GCC, especially Qatar, because it's playing a great role in the deal and in the reconstruction afterwards, with cooperation with Egypt. This will require an international conference to assess the damages and assess the required funds, with the participation of the international financial institutions for the Gaza reconstruction. There will be a road map, economic and development road map, as stated by Egypt, to form an international fund for the Gaza reconstruction during the international conference to be held in Egypt after the phase 1 and phase 2 of the agreement. All the international powers and institutions will take part of this conference to assess the contributions by each party to be mobilized in the Gaza reconstruction fund. And I think this will require a lot of plans, communications, and discussions that will be supported by the United Nations and international organizations' efforts and the United States, with President Trump, to make sure that the Gaza events do not happen or occur once again, to achieve a long-lasting peace and stability in the region, which was promised by President Trump during the past few hours, the release of the hostages. And we have a lot of preparations that will serve the Middle East and the entire world, and we need to wait till Trump assumes the office, and then we will talk again about the essence of reconstruction and the political settlement in the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ashraf Al-Ashri, for joining us here on Q News. Now back to our economic bulletin, and global equities rose on Friday, adding to weekly gains, as declining bond yields, stronger than expected Chinese growth figures, and upbeat earnings supported riskier assets. In Europe, the pan-continental Stoxx 600 index rose 0.7%, taking the weekly gain to 2.4%, its biggest one-week jump since September. Britain's FTSE 100 and Germany's DAX rose to records and up 1.5% and 1.1% respectively. Wall Street also firmed in early trade, with the S&P 500 gaining 0.9%, taking the weekly rise to 2.8%, fueled by strong bank earnings at the start of the new reporting season. In Asia, mainland China's blue chips and Hong Kong's Hang Seng both rose 0.3%. Japan's Nikkei 225 sagged 0.3%, powering earlier losses of more than 1%. Here's a recap of those economic headlines. US single-family home building increases 3.3% in December. IMF raises its global growth forecast for 2025 to 3.3%. And China's economy grows 5% in 2024. That's all for now. Don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at QNews EGY to stay informed. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.